Hello, and welcome to the Mission Critical podcast. I am Taylor and I am joined, as always, by L555 founder Mark Orr. Our goal here is to help catalytic leaders tackle big systemic problems together in community. So today we are going to tackle this idea of fellowship, or in the Greek, some people say koinonia, some people say koinonia. Mark, you can kind of maybe give us the right idea on that, since you are in Greece and probably can speak to it more than most listeners could. But yeah, Mark, I guess first of all, we'll start off. How you doing? How is life in Athens these days? What's happening?
Yeah, it's summertime here, so it's very hot, and we're, for the most part, enjoying it. The evenings cool down just enough with a fan or some type of AC if we have it in some rooms to keep us sane. This morning I just took some friends over to Marathon. It's about 45 minutes from here, famous Battle of Marathon, which was prophesied in Daniel and 490 BC, one of the most significant battles in terms of Western civilization. So I love showing people around the history and the significance of that. And tomorrow we go to Corinth. An hour on the other side of Athens. We'll head out there and show our friends the layout there. Corinthians, of course, is one of those passages in the Bible written by Paul that really gets into the life of the church, messy as it was. And so it's sort of fun to imagine the things that happened there and the things that we learned from this place that's about an hour's drive from here. Paul wrote the book of Romans from Corinth as well. And then there's a fun little thing I like to do. We go to, it's about 5 miles from ancient Corinth. There's a port called Century, and it's mentioned in Acts. And that's where Paul left on a boat and he finished his vow there. He cut his hair, and you can read in the Bible about that. There were some earthquakes around that part of Greece back in ancient times. So some of the communities that were along that edge of the Peloponnese actually sunk. So a lot of the piers that Paul would have used to board the boats there are actually underwater. So my daughter's going to do some snorkeling over top of that. So it's sort of fun place. And there's a little beach there too. We can go swimming in. So this is all part of what our week is.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I've been in Greece. I can relate on some level, but it always amazes me that we can take scripture and actually go. I mean, you can go on a regular basis to these places where God, where Jesus walked, where Paul walked, and see, I guess where Jesus walked would be a little far for you, but where Paul walked and where some of these scriptures that we read on a daily basis are from. And yeah, it kind of blows my mind. Yeah, but back to I guess why we're here today. We're talking about fellowship and this idea, this Greek word that you've used, and can you tell me a little bit about first of all how to pronounce it properly, and then just go into it a little bit.
Koinonia, it's pronounced koinonia. The OI is what we call a diphthong in linguistics in Greek, and so it's pronounced E. It's just like the word oikos, the concept of the extended family. It's actually pronounced ekos, not oikos. But you can say it however you want. It still means the same thing. So it's koinonia. And I'm probably not saying it quite right either. My Greek friends would probably say koinonia or something like that, but that's all right.
Yeah. So can you kind of define it for us as you understand it? What does it mean? And how is it kind of different than when I jump in and say, let's fellowship together? Like, how is it deeper than that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating study of this word, because it's not a concept that's very clear in the Old Testament, and then in the Greek world, and where the New Testament generally was written, they started to use the word koinonia, and it's a word that doesn't have any one good English translation. So it's actually translated using a number of different words in different instances where it shows up in the New Testament. And that shows how there's a depth to it, but you can't quite get at the full meaning with one English word. So yes, it is translated most commonly as fellowship, but it's more than that. It's also translated as communion, sharing, participation, contribution, and so on. And I think where it gets interesting is when we look at the angles of koinonia, where it's talking about sharing and contribution. Fellowship isn't just, we think of it as something that's very social, right? We're fellowshipping, we're having tea or coffee or going out for food with people and so on. And yeah, that's a part of it. But we can do all of those things without actually experiencing the depths of koinonia. Koinonia comes alive when we start to realize that it's really about a type of vulnerability. It involves us saying, sort of dropping the walls around us and saying, what I am or what I have is yours, and what you have is mine. It gets to a deeper level of interdependency like that. And it's related a little bit to, and I think in another podcast we talked about the one another some 60 or 70 times in the Bible when it says, do this to or with one another, right? There's so many calls in Scripture calling us to a certain type of life or culture with each other. It's absolutely essential. Sadly, especially I think in Western culture, and I can't speak for Eastern cultures because I'm not from there and I don't understand it as well, but in Western cultures, we tend to be very individualistic and very private. And we've turned the gospel into something very private, right? It's a personal decision to accept Jesus into my heart. Well, yes, but that's just the beginning. And I think the challenge we have of being relevant and having an impact and being salt and light in the earth is because we've made it so individualistic when it was never intended to be that. Jesus made sure that we understood, or at least we had the opportunity, if we want to understand what he really meant about the gospel of the kingdom. We'll get to that maybe in a few minutes and unpack that a bit more. But I hope that helps you get it a bit. There's about 20 references to koinonia, the Greek word koinonia in the New Testament, translated using different words in different contexts. Just before we move on, I want to make a point too that the concept of koinonia in all these ways, communion, sharing, fellowship, and so on, is not just between people, okay, between humans, between brothers and sisters, one to one, and so on. It's actually three different aspects to it. So one, yes, it's between people, but even more important before that, it's fellowship with the Father. It's fellowship with God himself. And the same fellowship that we have with God then empowers us, enables us, and sets sort of the model for us to have that kind of fellowship, interdependency, and sharing with one another. And then the third aspect is that as we do that, it actually spills out. It spills out to connecting with people who are not believers, connecting to the community around us. And that's where then the missional aspect of it comes in. And we can unpack that a bit more if we look more closely at the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, it would beautifully illustrates that concept of koinonia, the sharing beyond the church.
Right. It's a really good point. I kind of want to go down a side lane, but I'll refrain for now. Maybe we'll come back to the evangelism side of it. But could you you've mentioned some of the words that are translated from koinonia, but you mentioned the Good Samaritan. Can you just give us maybe like a couple more just quick examples of where this shows up in Jesus' life and Paul's life, the disciples? What places would this show up in Scripture?
Yeah. I mean, the one that we remember that sort of, it's an interesting passage. It's in Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 4, and so on in the early church. And it starts to talk about the fellowship and the sharing. The word sharing there, where they were sharing with one another, is the word koinonia, right? It's the same word. It's part of it's showing the active, very engaged, practical side of koinonia, but it's still using exactly the same word. He's saying, we had this koinonia going in our community in the early church. And so even in my earlier days, I thought, probably partly because of my upbringing, I thought, okay, Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 4, that's early church stuff, not really relevant anymore. God doesn't really want us to share all our possessions and, give it away to everyone. And I think there's an aspect of that that's true. The early Christians were thinking, okay, Jesus is returning again very soon, and there's no need for property. And they really took it to the all-out extreme. But I think in dismissing it that way, we've lost the essence of that was never intended to be lost, that is very applicable today. And that's that we're called into a type of culture, a type of community where we radically share with one another. Okay? So in that community, it should be normal to us in that community. To the world looking in from the outside, it looks radical, right? It's like, wait a minute, wow, you do that with each other? And he said, yeah, that's what we're about, right? That's what we should be, and we should retain that. A couple of places in Scripture that I think it goes to the real, I guess, the deeper, you could even call it the theological. I mean, all of this is theology, okay? But to some of those deeper mystical levels of this, and when I say mystical, I don't mean not real. I mean very, very real, but things that, challenge our thinking. And I think we can only understand when the Spirit in us helps us understand them. John 17 is the high priestly prayer, Jesus praying to the Father on behalf of the disciples. I mean, you need to study that. You need to read it and meditate on it over and over and over again. But in that passage, I think it's verse 21, he says that all of them may be one. Okay, he's praying to the Father, that all of them, that's us, may be one. That's the desire of Jesus for the body, for the church, that they all may be one. Why? Is it just sort of like a good thing? Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. No, it's just as you are in me, he says to the Father, just as you are in me and I in you, so that the bar is set as high as you can possibly get, right? The unity between the Father and the Son. And so why should we be one ourselves, following this ultimate example of Jesus and the Father? Why? So that the world may believe that you have sent me. So that the world, that means that world is watching. That means what we're doing. That means we're living koinonia in a visible way. It's so present that other people see it, right? It's meant to be a light and a witness to those around us in our neighborhoods and across the world. So that's an example of it there. Now, the word koinonia isn't used in that verse, but that's really Jesus unpacking this concept of koinonia that is expressed through the word koinonia later in the New Testament. And then let's add to that another passage in 1 John chapter 1. It says this right at the beginning. It says, that which from the beginning, which we have heard. So this is the things that he's sharing, the message, the revelation, the coming of Jesus, and so on, the gospel, that which we've heard, which we have seen with our eyes. This is the Apostle John saying, I was there, okay? Which we've looked upon and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. We often confuse the word with the written word, right? And we I think cross the line at times to worshiping the Bible. And the Bible is never meant to be worshiped. The word is the living word, the word of life. The life was manifested. That means it was made known, and we've seen it, and we bear witness. and declare to you that eternal life which was with the Father and was manifested to other. There's that unity between the Father and the Son. This eternal life which was with the Father and is now made known to us. So we're invited into that relationship. It's not just a relationship with Jesus. We're invited into a relationship with the triune God. That which we have seen and heard, we declare to you. Okay? We've seen it. We declare it to you. That, why? That you may also have fellowship with us. That you, everyone out there, may have koinonia with us. And truly, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So you see how it's with one another, with us, with the early believers, with all believers through all times, and with the Father and his Son, Jesus Christ. And these things we write to you. Why? That your joy may be made full. This is so central to the culture and the essence of our spiritual life. It's not individualistic. It's not isolationist. You cannot follow Jesus by yourself. You cannot come close to living out the essence of oneness and the Spirit of God in us by yourself. And it's not just going to church together on Sundays. That is like the worst way to think about it. It's a sharing and interdependence. And I'm learning. I'm no expert on this at all. We try to live it in our own family and life, but I'm learning more and more of this essence of what it means. And one of the points of this podcast really is not to tell you everything that I know, because I don't know a lot about koinonia, but you need to study it. We all need to study it and learn it and open up our hearts to letting God really just infuse us with it so that it spills out to everyone around us.
Yeah, and as you talk about that, it really makes me want to kind of analyze, I think, where we are. And I don't mean me. I mean me, but I don't mean just me. I mean, as I look around at other Christians, I see this deep longing for something. And I would like to say that that something is koinonia. It's that fellowship, that vertical and that horizontal, that unity. But yet, I get this sense as I look across churches today, as I look across, many Christians across denominations and spaces and places, that at least, in the places I know, they're longing for something, but it seems like we're not really headed in the direction of koinonia in some cases. Maybe we're headed in some other directions. I think about, adding more to the calendar, adding more busyness, more programs, or even in the direction of I've been hurt by someone, who is a Christian, so I'm actually going to walk away from that. How would you? This is maybe kind of this is a little bit of a question, maybe that you weren't prepared for, but how would you kind of bring the church into the loop on this? How can we help the church recognize that this is the longing of their heart, if they're not seeing it? Because I wonder if people are not really realizing that this emptiness they feel is this lack of koinonia.
I think this sort of, I don't know if it's a revelation, it's a new thought in my mind, is very recent to me, but is exactly that question. And here's where I'm thinking right now with this, is that it comes down to the gospel of the kingdom. We often talk about the gospel. Let's share the gospel with people. I don't hear people saying, let's share the gospel of the kingdom with people. But what Jesus went around preaching was the gospel of the kingdom. And even after Jesus rose from the dead, he spent 40 days, read in Acts, he spent 40 days moving around doing what? preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Read Acts, right at the beginning of Acts. That's what he did. What is the gospel of the kingdom? I think when we say that the gospel is this good news that Jesus died for your sins, well, okay, that's cool. I have been feeling guilty. I'm glad somebody died for my sins. But I think, and I'm not minimizing that. That's precious and essential. But I think what your question touches on another need, that people have an emptiness in them. They need God. They need forgiveness. But God created us as social beings. They need love. They need belonging. They need meaning. They need fellowship. And so when we preach the gospel of the kingdom, what we're doing is inviting people into a relationship with God, the forgiver, the redeemer, and a relationship with other people. A beautiful, loving, agape love relationship with other people. We're inviting them into community. That's these three ways. And as that community blossoms, it spills out, and other people come in and say, I want that too. Right? And I think that's the essence of mission, which we've forgotten it in our Western task-oriented way. Let's go out and reach people for Christ. And we've given up the essence of the gospel of the kingdom, but we keep trying to proclaim. But we're empty. We're not backing it up with the koinonia that needs to be very evident among us. So I would say that koinonia it's really part of our invitation for people to come into the kingdom. It's an element we've missed. In my experience, I think in most of our experiences, we know people and we see the depth of loneliness that many people have, of all cultures, people that we don't understand because their culture is so different, yet they're lonely. They long for relationship and friendship and belonging, and they don't want, they're saddened and despairing of rejection and loneliness. And the gospel of the kingdom is the antidote for that. It's the beautiful good news of relationship with God through Jesus and with each other.
Yeah. And it's interesting that people are so weary of it sometimes, or wary of it, however that word is pronounced. We long for it, yet we're so scared in our brokenness to step into that place and that space when it is presented to us. Past hurts, or just, we live in a broken world. And it makes me wonder, actually I don't wonder, because I know that we're settling for such a small portion of what we could be experiencing and could be, living out in our day-to-day lives. So change gears a little bit. I'm thinking of people like myself or others, actually probably people younger than me, maybe kind of hoping to enter into, the Christian world at large, maybe feeling called to be, working cross-culturally, going to a new place and space, and they need some training around this idea of koinonia and fellowship. How do you teach something like this when, maybe they've grown up in a place where, they've been settling for something significantly different or not to this depth, maybe, where church was a Sunday morning facade and you just pretended you were fine, and it was based on programs instead of deep relationships. How do you teach this? Like, can you stand in front of a classroom and articulate this, or is it something that is better taught a different way?
Yeah, there's different angles we could take on that question. I think one of them is that we need to stop sending out missionaries or Christian workers or evangelists or whatever that have not experienced this. How can you send somebody out with a message of the gospel, of the good news, who hasn't actually lived it yet? And so I think we have people, in fact, we sometimes, maybe more often than we realize, have people that are, crossing cultures to share the good news, but what they're actually doing is running away from loneliness at home, and they're looking for meaning and belonging elsewhere. I mean, that's good for them, but from a sort of a strategic effectiveness point of view, we need to be sending people out who can say, I've experienced this, I've lived it, and I want to share that good news with you. And this flows out of me because I have been invested in, I have been loved, I have experienced this love and fellowship and koinonia. And this is something I desperately want you to have too. And I'm going to love you just like the Good Samaritan loved his neighbors. I'm going to love you in that way. And then that's what draws people into this. So I think along that line, then, is we need to help people who are involved in mission and ministry and teaching to redefine what the gospel is, to redefine what success is. The success, and I you can jump all over me if you want, but I don't think success is saving souls. Will God save souls? Yes. Okay. Don't misquote me. Will God desire that all people come to know Jesus? Absolutely. But success, in terms of our efforts, is to see communities following Jesus together, expressing koinonia among them. And the power of the gospel is in that. I mean, it's so evident in John 17. I don't know why we ignore it. We make a huge deal about Matthew 28, go into the world and, make disciples. That's part of Jesus' instructions to us as well. But it follows teaching like John 17 and the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes and so on. These are things that define our culture, and that's how we end up impacting the world, is through the culture and the counterculture that we represent in our communities. So we need to make sure people are experiencing this, and then they're redefining success. It's not just about souls coming to Christ. It's not just about planting churches. It's about planting certain kinds of communities that have a certain quality to them. And that quality can be defined in many different ways, not least of which is having this type of koinonia. And so just to add one more thing to that is how do you teach that? Well, you can do some teaching, like academic kind of teaching, and drawing people's attention to what Scripture is saying. But I think more than any of that is you just have to live it. You have to model it. The teachers, the pastors, whoever it is that is sharing this with the people, need to demonstrate it. What did Jesus do when he wanted to teach about servant leadership? He kneeled down and washed their feet. That's the kind of thing we need to be.
Yeah, that's really good. And I totally agree. I think it needs to be, what's the saying? It needs to be caught more than taught.
Right.
And I'm just wondering in my head now, the link between koinonia and discipleship, in the sense that, we often talk about this word discipleship, but yet then we focus on, even Matthew 28, it says make disciples. But I think sometimes we read that as make Christians of all nations, because we have this idea that, after that moment of salvation, which you referenced a few minutes ago, we kind of think, okay, we check that box, our job is done. But discipleship actually requires a deeper investment. And as I think about discipleship more and more, I think discipleship is best lived out in this koinonia, because it has to be in that fellowship. I mean, Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. Well, unless we have this deep fellowship and deep shared life together, how can I imitate you? How can I imitate what you're doing, if I don't see the good, the bad, and the ugly, if I don't see how you respond in hard situations and in easy situations, how you extend grace, how you live, how can I learn to be a disciple from you if we're not in koinonia together?
Right.
And that, yeah, so it's something I've been kind of just wrestling with in general, but even more now in this moment because of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. You have to walk the road with people, and I'll just be really frank. I think most of the Christians I know are not walking the road with anyone. Maybe I'm being too hard on them. I don't know. I know some are, but I think many aren't. They're just going about being a Christian, but are they being a disciple that is walking the road with others? It's up to each person to sort of decide if that's what they're doing or not. But I tend to think that most aren't. So we're going through the motions of living Christian traditions, but we've lost the spirit of it. We've lost the koinonia. We barely have the kind of koinonia with God Himself, much less with each other. And I think what God is saying, what Jesus is saying in John 17, is the three or four angles on this are all intertwined. You can't split them up and say, I'm just going to do it privately. You can't just be friends with people without God involved. And you can't just, be good to your neighbor without the other aspects of koinonia involved. So it's beautiful if we accept it. But I think part of the problem is, to some degree, we don't understand it. And that's why I'm challenging people to study it, to pay attention to this, because it really, really, really matters. But I think the other aspect of this is that we don't want to understand it. Right. So we sort of poke around it and let's sort of pass over that passage. We're quite happy with the English concept of fellowship, but don't bother me too much with this deeper stuff, Mark. Like all these sharing, participation,
yeah,
interdependence. That's taking it a little too far.
Yeah, and we sometimes think that because that's what we see around us, then that must be the standard. If I'm living the same way as the other Christians I see around me, this must be the biblical way of life. When in reality, we go to a different country, into a different culture, and they live totally differently. And maybe they understand that's the biblical standard, and we don't ever go back and see what does the scripture actually say about these things and about how we should be living. Yeah, kind of along this line. I always love people's examples. So what would you say is like an example, maybe a couple examples of koinonia that you've experienced in your life? And maybe this will help us kind of flesh out this concept in a practical way.
Yeah, I'll just give a couple of examples. One of these I may have shared in another podcast. I can't really remember. One is just a small little incident, but I think it's a powerful incident. And it happened when I was, before I was married, 30 years ago. I used to travel with a group of people talking about mission topics all across Canada. And we would sort of stay in people's homes from time to time. And sort of your typical thing, getting hosted in a home. Well, I remember visiting this young family once in Winnipeg, Canada. And we stayed in this home. They were very welcoming, and we had a good time there. And then I think when we left, I think it was when we were leaving, he said, you know what? Here's our key. Let me show you where it's hidden. So it's under the mat over here, wherever. And he showed where the house key was hidden. And he said, whenever you come back, and if you come back and we're not here, find the key and go in and use the house. Don't worry about it. Okay. Just come in, help yourself, find a bed, eat the food, whatever, if we're not home. And to me in that day, that was radical. That was like, wait a minute. you know, Canadians in general are, make sure we lock the door, and they're very, uh, cautious, about thieves, and they don't want to be vulnerable and all that. And here's a family that said, no, here, help yourself. Most would say, well, call us, give us a day's notice, and if we can help you, we will. Well, these people went further. They said, don't call us, just come, and if we're not home, here's where the key is. That I never forgot that. Never forgot that. And I've in my married life and with our children and so on, we've tried to practice that. Maybe not, I would say pretty much almost everywhere we a lot of people. We have no idea how many people know where the key's hidden, and every week or so, a couple more people know where the key's hidden. And if the neighbors were actually paying attention to us, they would know too, because we've been showing people where the key's hidden. So and we've tried to live that out and say, this house is yours. Okay. Use it as you need to. I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but I would like people to be challenged to go beyond their comfort zone long enough so that it becomes their comfort zone. You realize this is sort of cool. This is like living in God's space, saying this house belongs to God. It belongs to the kingdom, right? And this is the culture. This is the interdependence. Our homes are shared with each other, and that's just this little story I just shared also backs up what I said earlier about how do you teach this? Well, you just do it, and you do it with others, right? So that young couple in Winnipeg, they didn't give me a lecture about it. They just said, here's the key. Well, it impacted me, and I've passed that on to other people and done it in my own family. So yeah, it's more caught than taught. The other example I want to put forward is, and this is what I may have shared earlier, but we've lived in a type of ministry that depends on all kinds of help from other people, the prayers, financial support, and so on. And many people have been generous in that way. What I've appreciated is with one or two of them who not only, sign up and they have their automatic deductions from their bank account that goes to our ministry account and supports us, but some of them have sat down with us and said, every once in a while, and said, okay, so what are your needs? What's going on? Where do you need our money right now? Right. And they actually just face it right up and says, in a sense, our money is God's, and we just want to ask straight up, what are your needs right now? And maybe we can fit in, and be part of the solution to that. Right. Rather than the other way around where, you go out asking, asking for money or fundraising. Right. And people are like, oh, okay, I'll give you $50 a month or whatever, and that's wrong. But I really appreciate it when someone says, you know what, this is our ministry, and we're going to go out there and become vulnerable and say, how can we be part of your lives? It's and that's what koinonia is. It's reaching out and sharing both ways. It's not just being passive and waiting until someone needs your help. So it's really a dynamic, interdependent situation.
Yeah, and I think I've experienced the same thing in my life where it has been caught, some of these moments when people do things, and I'm sure some of them do it intentionally as a teaching moment, because some of these moments come from my Bible college days or my younger days, but it's that moment where someone does something so shocking in comparison to the average person that you go like, why the heck are you showing me where your key is? I've only known you for 3 days. Or like, why are you giving me your car? Why are you doing these things? And it's these kind of simple moments, but these huge gestures that are just blatant expressions of this open-handedness before God. And, Acts chapter 2, the sharing of everything together, like we're brothers and sisters. If you have need, then I have the resource, and we share it all together. And yeah, I would totally agree. This is not something you can teach from the front of a room. It's something that has to be lived out, because it's those moments that have taught me the most. You know, those moments where I've experienced that sense of koinonia, and I've kind of had to like check myself and say, okay, like this is weird. Like there, you know, and it never should be that way. But sometimes, you know, it's unfortunate. But the reality is, people's kindness, people's sense that, you know, that we're all brothers and sisters is it's so deep and so different that, you know, we almost step back and go, that's strange. And then we always have to readjust. But it's those moments of shock, I think, where God kind of teaches us and speaks to us, and invites us to live that way, invites us to live into that, because it's what we need.
Exactly. And in some ways, it's outrageous, right? God's love for us is outrageous. And our love for one another needs to be outrageous. And the risks we take, so-called risks we take with each other, need to be outrageous. But they're also the safest thing you could ever do, right? I mean, they're risky on a human level, and sometimes we get dinged and hurt and backstabbed. Yeah, that all happens. That all happens. But I think these are things that are so clear in the New Testament, and yet it really boggles my mind. Why don't we see it and live it? I don't understand quite yet why we're blind to some of these things. It's sort of like when you buy a car, you know, or you're hunting for a car and you like a certain model, and then for the next few weeks, you know, you see them everywhere because somehow you're tuned into it, right? You're driving down the street, wow, Absolutely. There's a lot of those cars, right? You're sort of tuned into it. And I think that's the point we want to make here, is we want you as a student of the Bible, and as someone who listens to the Spirit of God, to be tuned into this, so that you start to see it all over the New Testament. The one another statements, the koinonia, and the call to a whole new counterculture, the gospel of the kingdom. We want you to see this everywhere in the Bible. Don't take our word for it. Don't take my word for it. Just go and read and look and listen and pray, and ask God, where are your blind spots? In what ways have you been reading the scripture through a certain lens that has caused you not to see some of these fundamental things that represent the gospel of the kingdom? The beauty of the gospel of the kingdom is beyond what we can imagine, beyond what we allow ourselves, I think, to imagine. Because there's still a bit of selfishness in us, maybe a lot of selfishness, right? We're very self-centered people. We want the gospel for ourselves to relieve our guilt, but it's way more than that. And if we're going to reach the world, in a sense, if we're going to be a light and a witness in this world in an effective way, we need to have that saltiness, and koinonia is part of that saltiness. Just one last thing before I forget it is, you know, we were talking about the early church in Acts and how they sort of had this extreme outrageous expression of sharing and koinonia. And I used to think, well, that happened there, and then shortly after that, obviously, it didn't happen. But that's not the case. If you read some of the historical literature that comes just after the time of the apostles, like the 2nd century, and where you find descriptions of the life of Christian communities, you will see that. The one that I particularly comes to mind is Justin Martyr, and if you read his writings, he defends the Christian faith to the Roman emperor, and he says, "Hey, this is what's happening. We're keeping things in common. We're living and sharing and carrying each other's burdens." And for some reason, this just speaks to people, and people want that, right? He's describing koinonia, and that I think is a big part of the answer of why did an illiterate early church, against all odds, with an incredibly powerful, violent empire, you know, persecuting them. Why did a church of a band of communities like this transform and turn the empire upside down? Comes down to this, you know, no technique of evangelism and new mission strategies are really going to work unless we get back to some of these basics of what it means to be communities of disciples of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one last question, and I don't really know if there is a good answer, but I'm curious to see how you maybe would approach it. I've heard you say a statement, and I think you borrowed the statement from an author, because I think I also read the same part of the book. But you often use this statement, in front of a watching world. Is that maybe Frank Viola?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I think as I hear this, like living out koinonia in front of a watching world, I love that idea. But then I also recognize that oftentimes koinonia, the fellowship that we express, tends to be in a circle that can be fairly closed, in the sense that, if I'm living out my authentic self, if I am, being very vulnerable, if there's accountability, if all of these things are happening, then there's this tension between, I want that to be a closed circle. But the reality is, if we want to actually be witnessed, then it needs to be a bit of an open circle. How do you kind of resolve that tension, or how do you kind of see that playing out? Because I see the importance of both, and they're both vitally important to the church and vitally important to the gospel and what God is doing on earth. But sometimes I get a little bit tangled up in how we can be both of those things at once. So, yeah, do you have any thoughts or any way we could or that you could speak to that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any one answer. There's not a formula to that. I think if we desire both, we're going to find both. There's times when we come together with believers, and we have a deep type of fellowship and prayer and Bible study and communion and so on, and that's precious. That's needed. We're called together to that, and that's absolutely a core part of what it means to be disciples of Jesus, is getting along and gathering and assembling with other believers. That's what the definition of the word ekklesia means, which is the word we sort of poorly translate into the word church. Ekklesia was an assembly, right? We're called to assemble and to do things together as God's people. But it's also, unless you're, I don't know, maybe a monk living in a monastery, sort of secluded from the world. Most of us are not that. We're out and about, as us Canadians say, doing things and carrying on with business and life. And we're doing that sometimes with other believers and sometimes not. And so as we do that, we should be carrying that culture with us. If the culture is embedded in us, then we treat other people that way. It rubs off. Okay. Now, I think it's a lot easier to do that when there's two or three people together. So we're actually treating each other in love as we go into the world, through business and schools and government and any project, recreation, going to the movies, whatever it might be. How do we treat people differently, right? Where I lose my sanctity the most is in my driving, right? It just gets me. All right. I get upset at people driving. I get frustrated and stuff. And I know that. And I need God to help me change that aspect of my behavior. And so once in a while, I'm trying to be a little bit, not once in a while, I'm always trying, but once in a while, I'm successful at being a kinder, gentler, caring driver, and understanding where other people are. In Canada, it's very common for people to cross the street and everybody waits because it's become part of the culture, right? Pedestrians sort of rule the roads. In Greece, where I live, that's not the case. And so once in a while, when you stop and you see someone that's been waiting to cross and the traffic is too busy and you stop, And this happened to me the other day. This lady looked up and just sort of gave a little smile and walked across the road. It's like, this is unusual. Somebody stopped and let me by, right? Now, did I have a chance to stop and share Christ with them? No, but that's okay, because the koinonia is not between me and this random stranger on the street. It's between me and God and the Spirit can speak to her. It's a partnership. That's a word that I don't know if I brought it up earlier today, but a big aspect of koinonia is partnership. It's partnership. We're in this together. Okay, it's partnership with each other as Christians, but it's also it's this partnership with God, and God is going to take care of aspects that perhaps we can't. God can explain why to this random stranger, why I was kind and let them cross the street. So there's these little ways that we can do these things that is living this before other people. I have friends who've explained to me situations where they were in sort of high-ranking business situations, and they were able to act in a way that was just radically countercultural, that raised questions. People said, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why do you act that way? Right? I think as we learn how to do this, and it's not meant to be something mechanical, let's go out and do something so that everybody sees. I'm not saying that. It's not like trying to get attention. It's not about drawing attention to yourself. It's about being a community in a way that that is quite comfortable being countercultural around other people. It's the light on the hill that you don't cover, right? Let it shine. Let it shine. And so I think that's what it is. Now, frankly, we should have a lot more examples of how this works. And sometimes I think we struggle with examples because it's not that common. But look around you and look at people that you know, and look for those exceptions where, wait a minute, that was really cool. The only way we can explain that is that it was koinonia in action in that person's life or that little group's life. And then try to model that, do it yourself. It will spread because it's designed to spread. It's God's design as part of the witness that we are to be as communities in the world.
Yeah, that's really good. And it's great. It's great. Lisa, there's a lack of examples, but it's great. In my head, I'm running through, 2 or 3 couples that I've met over the years. And I'm like, yeah, these are great examples of that. And I hope people in general, I've been in kind of the ministry world, but I hope that the average person can also point to some examples that they can imitate. Yes. Paul, imitate me as I imitate Christ. I hope other people can kind of hold on to those examples as well. As we conclude, Mark, any final comments before we finish up today?
Yeah, just as I always say in any podcast we do, is don't take my word for it. Go back to your own studies. Make it personal. And our prayer is that the Spirit of God would challenge, teach, convict, empower. And like John said in 1 John 1, he said, so that your joy may be full. This isn't a tedious, laborious thing. When you let yourself into this kind of lifestyle as a follower of Jesus, you're going to find joy there. Not always happiness. Sometimes there are difficult times. You're going to find joy and fulfillment in it. And that's how we witness. And that's how people ultimately come to know Jesus, as a person who loves them deeply. But most people need to see that kind of love between people before they start to take your words and your proclamation seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us today for the Mission Critical podcast. If you would give us a review, subscribe, share this podcast with a friend, we would be so grateful for that. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn, or you can check us out at lead555.com. Here at L5, we help leaders tackle problems together. And so hopefully our conversation today will help you to think deeply and to move forward courageously in your leadership. Thank you so much for listening.